Thanks for coming. It's good to be here. Well, 75% of life is changing right now as we move from the industrial age into the internet age. We know this because it happened 100 years ago when 75% of life changed as we moved from the agrarian age into the industrial age. And that what matters most is that this is the decade when we create the social infrastructure for the 21st century. Now, I'm wearing a bowler hat today because this is what men wore 100 years ago. It's a symbol of the great middle class that made our nation so prosperous in the last century. 100 years ago, you could tell how much money a man made by the kind of hat that he wore. This is what rich people wore. It's actually my father's hat when he was in college. If you haven't been on campus for a while, they don't wear this much anymore. But there weren't many rich people, and so most people wore the working man's hat. But there was a small emerging class called the middle class. And African American and white men who were in the middle class, that emerging class, wore this hat. And it was the middle class that ruled the industrial age. And the industrial age and the factory permeated our culture, surrounding everything that we do. My favorite team even named after the factory. 100 years later, today, we are moving into a new age, and there's a new class of workers emerging in society. Now, I live in the state of Wisconsin, but for 20 years I lived in the state of Kansas, and I don't know if you know this, but they have mandatory continuing education. In order to gain residency in the state of Kansas, you have to take a class on the Wizard of Oz. So I signed up for my class on The Wizard of Oz. It turns out The Wizard of Oz was written 100 years ago. Now, the movie with Judy Garland came out in 1939, but the book by L. Frank Baum came out in 1900. And Baum lived in a different world. He lived in an agrarian society, a society of extended families and small farms and fresh you could actually eat spinach 100 years ago. And he saw that his wonderful world was being destroyed. And he was against that. He was aghast. And so he created the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and the Lion to represent the virtues of the agrarian age. Because it wasn't just an economic way of life. It was also the height of civilization, the height of morality. What was destroying his world was the industrial age, the age you and I grew up in, that we're familiar with, of factories and cars and suburbs and offices. But to Baum, that was an awful thing that was destroying his height of civilization. Now, he set his story in Kansas. He had never been to Kansas, but Kansas back then was the golden land of opportunity, like California in the 1960s. Just 10 years earlier, Horace Greeley, this New York journalist, said, "Go west, young man." And people back then actually believed New York journalists. And so 1 million to 1.5 million people moved to Kansas within just 10 years. And Baum said, even in this paradise, this awful transition is taking place. 100 years later, we are again going through this awful transition, moving from one age into the next. And it's not just about using a cell phone and getting on Facebook. It also comes down to our concept of morality and what is right in civilization. Now, the driving force of the last century, literally and figuratively, was the automobile. It was the automobile that led to the factory, that led to suburbs, that led to offices, community colleges, this university, etc. The driving force of this century is the World Wide Web. This is Tim Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web. And this is a force that is so powerful and so strong that it changes society. And it leads to 9 different shifts. We can't go over all of them right now, but the big 3, number 1, people work from home. Instead of going to offices, people work from home because they're more productive and their companies are more profitable. Another shift is that trains replace cars, and this is happening right now, today, even in the United States. Shift number 3 is that dense neighborhoods replace suburbs. Now, bottom line, life becomes better for our children and our grandchildren in this century than it was for us in the last century. Just like life for us was better in the last century than it was for L. Frank Baum. All of these changes happened within just 20 years. So 75% of life changes between 2000 and 2020. Not everything will be different in 2020. In 2020, we'll still be reading books. We'll still be going to church, synagogue, or mosque. We'll still be watching American Idol. But 75% of life changes in this very short period of time. We know this because if you went back to 1920 and walked into a house, maybe your house, and walked into the kitchen, you could make supper. If you walked into the same house, the same kitchen just 20 years earlier, you would have no idea how to make supper. And so 100 years ago, my grandmother was an adult educator and taught people how to use a gas stove. When I was growing up, we had this phrase, now we're cooking with gas. And I knew it meant we're hip, we're cool, we're modern. I had no idea it actually meant now we're cooking with gas. And so what happens in this short period of time is economics and jobs change. In 1900, in Baum's time, 50% of people were employed in farming. That decreased as factory work went up. Where you see that crossover, that's a 9-shift. Life has to change. 100 years later, today, factory work in the decline, knowledge work on the increase. Where you see that crossover, life has to change. Now, you may see articles that factory output is growing, but that's not meaning that people are employed there. The factory of the 21st century has 2 employees, a man and a dog. Man's job to feed the dog, dog's job to keep the man from touching the machinery. So when you see factory output going up, that doesn't mean people are employed. We can divide this into different categories. We're right now in the middle of crisis and conflict, and at that turning point, 2020, game over. What we mean by game over, if you interview 100 kids in 2020 and you say, would you like to work in an office and live in a suburb and drive a car, or would you like to work from home, take the light rail, and live in a dense neighborhood? 90% of the kids will say, give me the telework, let me ride the light rail. Well, on the left is my son, Willie, with his foster brother, Sammy, and he's in middle school here, and he comes home one day, and he tells me about Jenny Fredrickson, the last person who can write cursive. There's these times as a parent where you have absolutely no idea what to say. So I'm standing there with my mouth open saying, you can't write cursive? And he says, well, I can write my name, but that's about it. So as responsible parents, we do the right thing. We take them out of that school, and we put them into a good school where everybody's going to college. And so on graduation day from high school, I'm optimistic, I'm positive. I revisit the issue with him. I say, Willie, how many of your friends write cursive? And he looks at me and he says, who does that? That means nobody does that. Cursive, now an ancient craft like canning vegetables or shoeing horses. And this is the first transformation that Gen Y made. Gen Y is creating the 21st century. This is the first economic thing that they did, was to transfer writing from a tangible into an intangible so that they can work with it. And so when things become intangible, people then can earn better living as knowledge workers working from home. A knowledge worker works with his or her brain and the internet. Why knowledge workers are important is that they create 4 additional local jobs. In the last century, factory workers were the most important sector in society because they created 4 additional jobs. You sold the goods to Wyoming, Connecticut, Singapore, etc., and money came in. Knowledge worker works in the same way. This is the silent revolution with more and more people working from home. Why? Because they're 25% more productive than people who work in an office. And companies simply will not be able to compete globally in this century without having their best people be productive. And so offices are declining. They cost money, but they save people 2 hours a day, their employees there, and then the best people won't move. And as an employer, you don't want your best people to move because you want them to be where they're most productive. Suburbs are declining because they take too much time. They're being replaced by dense neighborhoods. You can even see that in this area around here. But the average person spends 2 hours a day driving to and from shops, stores, commuting. That's simply 25% of productive time, and you simply cannot remain competitive when you're wasting 25% of your productive time. Cars are in decline and being replaced by trains. They're too slow. They kill 1 million people a year worldwide, but you can't work and drive. And so on a train or light rail, you can work while you're traveling, and therefore you can serve the most valuable thing that knowledge workers have, which is their time. Well, this is Willie, and he's grown up now, and he's gone out to Portland, Oregon, and he comes back for Easter, Christmas. And so one Christmas, I'm reading the local newspaper, and a banner headline, cell phones replacing watches. And I'm fascinated by this, and I read the whole story word for word. And then I turn to Willie, just to fact check the story here, and I say, Willie, how many of your friends wear a watch? And he says, well, none, except the rich kids who are trying to show off. And then he says, is this about that stupid article in the newspaper? And I'm tearing my hair out, and I'm saying, Willie, the article is agreeing with you. You and the article are saying the same thing. Why is it stupid? And he says, because it's not news. Because it's not news. And so everything that I've just told you and talked about is not news to Gen Y. Gen Y, born between 1980 and 2000, the largest generation in human history in our country, and that generation that is creating the 21st century. They may not be able to know it up here, but down here, they're creating the kind of society that they need in the 21st century. And so, 75% of life is changing as we move from one era into the other. This happens very quickly. The future is now 24 months from now. The past is now 24 months ago. And we're moving from the industrial age into the internet age. And this is the decade. We've been through a decade where they've created the technology, the web and Facebook and all those other things. And some of that will still continue, but this is the decade where we reformulate society to meet the needs of our post-industrial society for the 21st century. It's a very exciting time to be alive. As a person in my age group, it's a wonderful time to talk to people who are over 80 to find out what life was like back then, because that's a predictor of where we're going. And then to talk to the kids and to find out what they're doing as they create the 21st century. That's 9 Shift for 2010. My name's Bill Draves. Have a great 21st century. Thank you very much.